Hello. There we are. Might be a little hot, but that's all right. So Dad made two mistakes this week. The first was asking me to teach, and the second was giving me absolutely no guidelines. So, yeah, let's have some fun. So no, I just kind of decided, I did a Skype group with a young progressive Christian group in Dallas last week. And they kind of specifically wanted to know, how do we hear from God after God? And that statement alone might shock a lot of us because we're still plugged in many times to communities that the phrase after God might bother us. But what we mean is after the complete deconstruction of everything we thought was God. How do we hear God when that is gone? And so kind of what I did was I just decided, let's go and, oddly enough, see what the Bible has to say about a few things, see what Jesus has to say about a few things, and then see what a couple scholars have to say about a few things. And not because I think we need to give up on hearing from God, but I think we need to stop acting like we can. Now, I want you to keep that in your minds as we're talking today, because that phrase is going to offend you now, but later on you're going to embrace it. And I'm not using notes today. I'm just kind of going with where I feel like I need to go with this. And so if I stumble up, forgive me. So we've kind of been raised, any of us who have been in the grace charismatic post-Azusa Street world of American Christianity, we've been raised with a certain expectation of how God will talk. Okay, and we're not going to get into all the other stuff. I'm not here to debate anything about gifts and all that stuff. That's not important to me right now. What's important is hearing God, okay? And so in a post-Azusa Americanized Christian world, which we're all in, how do we hear God in a way that more closely resembles the way that God has chosen to be heard in our history? And primary to understanding this is the term theophany. Now, this is a term I use a lot, and I've used it in my class at the house, and a lot of times I just use it, and people are like... And it's an eruption of divine knowledge, basically. We come to know God by something that happens. It's like an epiphany with theos at the beginning, okay? And specifically in Israel's history, it's called a Yahwistic theophany, and kind of the idea is, and this is a really convoluted way to say it, but it works, is that we only recognize that God was involved in the burning bush by the fact that the bush was not consumed. Okay, so we don't recognize it while it's happening. And I think this is kind of like, if we'll be honest, this is our lives. We look back at our life, and a lot of times we don't realize, man, that was the hand of God until years later. And that moment when we realize that was God, that's a theophany. Okay, we realize that God was involved. The natives in Canada, the First Nation people, they talk about walking backward into the future. And what they mean is you're constantly looking at your past while you're moving forward. Because your past is what informs you so that you can move forward. Okay? Now, with Israel, what this looks like is, and for the sake of not reteaching everything we've talked about in the Bible class, there's a particular school of prophets that starts combining the Hebrew texts into a Bible. And this happens after the Babylonian exile. This is in 589 BCE. Okay, so these guys have come together. They've decided we need a textual religion. Why? Because many things, but they've been in slavery, they've been exiled, they've been dispersed. 10 of the tribes are missing, only 2 have come back. There's a lot going on to why they're doing this. It's not just we want a Bible so we can lord it over people. Okay, so it's much more involved than just trying to create a new religion. It has to do with trying to preserve a national identity. It has to do with trying to record a history within which God was very active. And so when you're standing 2,000 years in the future from something and you look back, It's very easy to say, yes, God was involved in that because we came out the victors. And this is typically what we do. History is written by the victors. And so then anybody who has victory attributes it to God. God was involved. I mean, we do it today still. Super Bowl. Oh, I got to give God all the glory. Why? He was not in any way involved in that game. But we still do it. We look back at our lives and we say, oh, that was God. Okay? So we're not unique, and neither was Israel. We do it today. They did it back then. Revisionist history is how we look at our lives. We love our grumpy Aunt Mabel, even though she was kind of a jerk before she died, because after she died, we forget all that. And we just remember the good stuff. So we do it with our family life. We do it with ourselves. We don't remember everything about our life that is not so happy. And in more extreme cases, we actually shut it out, and it creates a problem. And so, as we approach this stuff, we're not even into hearing God yet. We're just in the Bible, but we've got to understand that this is how it works. We don't get to stand in the moment and say, this is God. Because the second we do that, we become something of an idol. Okay? So when a group of priests and prophets get together and start compiling Israel's ancient literature, and they paint it in such a way that it looks like God was audibly speaking to everyone all the time, it's probably more accurately that they realize that because of the fruit of all of these events, they have now been blessed. Well, then it must have been that God was doing all these things. Okay, so that doesn't discount that God was speaking, but it also is not the evidence. Okay, so we don't stand in our future and just assume God's activity in everything that we've done. Okay? Okay, so now we're going to have our first Bible verse, finally. Our first of two. And if you've been in this church for any amount of time, if you could put it up there, Nathan, because I don't have one in front of me. You've heard this verse quite a few times. Long ago, God spoke many times and in many ways to our ancestors through the prophets. And now in these final days, he has spoken to us through his Son. God promised everything to the Son as an inheritance, and through the Son, he created the universe. And you can stop there. That's actually all we need. So notice here, I actually like the Living Translation. I'm glad you went with that. He says, in these final days, he has spoken to us through his Son. And everywhere we go in the postmodern, post-Christian world now, what we hear is the testimony of Jesus is the spirit of prophecy, right? And that might be true, but we've got to understand that necessitates some digging into who Jesus is. Because you can say the testimony of Jesus is the spirit of prophecy, but if the next line out of your mouth is, and he will return to, unleash his wrath upon the nations, well, then your testimony is not the spirit of prophecy. Okay, so we've got to understand, and that ought to toy with some notions right there, that if it can't line up with who Jesus says his Father is, then it is in no way, shape, or form a prophetic utterance. Okay? And I know what this does to our notions of biblical prophecy. Because we're like, well, but it's there, but that doesn't mean it's right. Okay? So, how is prophecy recognized then? Is prophecy recognized in the moment? Do we stand in a moment and know that a word that someone is giving is correct? No, it's only recognized when fulfillment has happened. Because otherwise it's not a prophetic word. If it has not been fulfilled, if there is not proof that it was A, correct, and B, fulfilled, then it is not recognized as a prophetic utterance. Okay, and we talked about this in class. This is kind of primary to understanding why morality cannot enter the Christian discussion. Because something is only recognized as sin when it has been forgiven. The act of forgiveness is what lets us know that that activity was a problem. Okay, and so otherwise we just keep doing it. And we don't know. I don't need forgiveness for that. Why? Because I haven't ever been offered it. Okay, so it starts to kind of toy with our notions a little bit of, well then, do we need to approach God for forgiveness? No. Because that necessitates that it hasn't already been forgiven. Okay? So this kind of toys with some things. And again, we start to recognize what's going on with God, but only after the fact. We see, for me, you know, certain things. And Richard Rohr has this great book called Everything Belongs. And some of us won't like it because he talks about learning to embrace the hard times just as we do the positive. But the idea is when we learn to find out how things fit into our story, we live a fuller life. Even the parts of our life that we don't want to fit into our story. Okay, and a very easy one for me is, you know, because of all the rejection I received from certain groups, it pushed me in a particular direction where now I've found more fulfillment than I ever would have over here. So that's recognizing God's activity even in some of the stuff that I didn't like. Not that God caused that to happen, but He works. Okay? So that's kind of the notion that I want to approach things with, to say, okay, if we're going to talk about prophecy and we're going to talk about hearing God, let's talk about it in this idea of theophany, that we recognize it later on. You know, we recognize some things in the Old Testament as being about Jesus because we see the fulfillment in Jesus. Otherwise, I mean, if He hadn't fulfilled that, we're never going to say that's a prophetic word. Is this making sense? Is it helping? Okay, and this works the same way when we start to get into the discussions of, oh, for 2,000 years, the church has believed this, that, or the other thing. No, the church has really believed a bunch of things for 2,000 years. My favorite is that like everybody who has something to say now wants to say, well, for the first 19 centuries of the church, it's like up until the 1800s, we all believed, we were just scattered and dispersed, and there were schisms, and it's like nothing different. Okay, why? Because we've always been human. But this is why things like the Trinity don't get worked out until 300 years after the incarnation. Is because they realize later, oh wow, you know, this is God taking on human form and actually becoming one of us, and it is not just some prophet. This is a divine being. And so they work it out later because they begin to realize what's going on. Okay, we're not smart enough to get it in the moment. None of us are. We never do. Brad Jersick said to me the way that he has started hearing God now is to look back at his life and have God tell him, there I was. You know, and I think that's a very healthy approach because, number one, it does for us what it did for Israel. It helps us be reminded of the faithfulness of God in our history. And this is what the Old Testament is really all about. It's a book meant to help remind other Jews of the faithfulness of God within their history. And a lot of the facts are messed up. And there's a lot of myth. And there's a lot of parable. Why? Because none of that stuff is important when the point is God is faithful. You can tell a myth to illustrate that God is faithful. You can tell a parable to illustrate that God is faithful. Do we think that Jesus was the first teacher to ever tell a parable? No. Where did He learn it? His tradition. So that means it's going to be throughout the Old Testament too, and they're just not kind enough to say, and this He spoke to them in a parable saying, because it's not written from a biographical standpoint, biographical. So let's look first at what it means in Israel's history to have a mediator, because I think this precedes all of our discussion about what a prophet is. Okay? And this is Klaus Westermann. He's an Old Testament guy, been dead for a long time. And he says, let's cut right in. Besides this, there is the distinctive accusation of God made in the distress of their office by those called to be mediators. Boy, that is not the way to start off a grace teaching, is it? There is a direct line from the complaint of Moses and the complaints of the prophets to Jeremiah, in whose case it assumed an especially powerful and terrifying aspect, and finally to the cry of the Savior on the cross. This complaint of the mediator from Moses onward throughout the Bible is a strong, clear indication that the calls are not fantasy or religious enthusiasm, but a hard reality which sent the person called on a journey which he certainly did not seek or devise for himself. Okay, so essentially what he's saying there is that when someone is recognized as a mediator within Israel's history, when we're reading the Bible, there's always an accusation against God from the mouth of the mediator. They don't like what God has called them to do. They don't want it. They don't want to be on the stage in front of people. They don't want to travel and teach. They don't want to hold prophecy conferences. Look at Moses. What's he doing? He's tending sheep. He's telling God, no, send my brother, send my sister. I'm not going to do this. Okay, so there's our first qualification for anybody today who wants to call themselves a prophet or a mediator. Do you want it? Because if you do, you're not. I mean, we can say that, like, this is the famous line about people pursuing politics, like, no one's cut out for the job and you shouldn't trust one who wants it. And, you know, it's this idea is the mediator doesn't want the job. Jesus says, take this cup from me. We have this notion that Jesus just embraced his death. Oh, yes, it's so willing. He wasn't willing. He didn't want to die. He was human. No human wants to die, especially wrongly accused and being put to death for something that isn't really like a sentence like that's justified for what you've done. Jesus doesn't want to do it from that standpoint. He says, nevertheless, your will be done, because he understands. I mean, this is probably like, he doesn't want to do it. Nevertheless, your will be done. Okay? So these are the mediators of Israel. These are people who, they're not always like Kuth. They don't always say the right thing. They don't want their job, and they tend to argue with God quite a bit. I'm good with that. I've tried to start like 9 different businesses just to do something else, and nothing ever works. So then, and I'm jumping all over this book, because it's not the Bible, so you can do that. You have to read the Bible front to back. Joking. So then he says, the prophets had their day, and that their voices heard especially loudly and frequently at the divisive crises and turning points of history. This fact alone is an infallible sign that the prophetic word grows out of and issues in particular historical moments. I want us to get that phrase. The prophetic word arises out of particular historical moments. One cannot detach the word from its context and obtain a valid timeless wisdom any more than one can subtract a message from the event it announces. So essentially what he's saying here then is that when we're looking at Israel's prophets, that the idea is that what they're speaking, I'll quote Marcus Borg here, is for their then, not our now. Does that make sense? It's about whoever wrote the last part of Isaiah, the third Isaiah guy, did not think that in 500 years a Redeemer was coming. He thought that it was immediate. Or she, whoever it was. Okay, they're not giving, in 1,000 years, God will set you free. This is not prophecy in the Old Testament. Okay? Then we go over and we read, the real miracle, however, is the succession of the prophets, which begins side by side with the first king of Israel and runs parallel with the royal history, coming to its end with the last king. Every one of them is and remains an individual. Many stand quite alone, and many have a small group around them. None move the masses. Again, this is a biblical Old Testament prophet. They are not cult of personality stage people. Number one, they don't want their calling. Number two, they never garner favor with the masses. Wide is the road that leads to destruction. Narrow is the way that leads to truth and life. Okay, the wide road that leads to destruction is the easy one that you see everybody on. Has nothing to do with you're going to get saved or not get saved depending on which church you're going to. Has to do with this notion that just because crowd speak is the loudest thing in your life doesn't make it right. Okay? And, I mean, I'm not going to do it, but we could, like, name quite a few people who probably fall under this idea that, like, it's a verification of their gift that they've got a lot of people who follow them. And it's just not that way. I mean, even in Jesus, it's not that way. Oh, but he had 5,000. Yeah, but he died with 11. And Paul died with none. You know, so it's easy to get into that game. It's much more difficult to understand that the particular call that God has upon each and every one of our lives is a call that is going to not appeal to the masses. Okay? And then go here, and then we'll start talking some more. We all know the story of David and Nathan. Good little story. What happened at this moment will now, without any important changes, accompany the path of the kings of Israel to the bitter end. I love the way this guy writes. From here on to the last word of the last prophet to the last king, the prophetic word consists of the same two basic ingredients. The charge, which points simply to the fact of guilt, and the announcement of judgment, the punishment of God for this guilt. And it is always upon the empire. Okay? It is always upon the empire. This is the voice of the prophet in the Old Testament. There is never a time in the Old Testament where a soothsayer or a seer is called a prophet. A seer is someone who looks into the future and gives you a word about your future, and a soothsayer who looks into the past and gives you a word about your past. Neither one of those are ever called a prophet in the Bible. In fact, Saul is condemned for seeing one of them. So the notion of psychic power and the notion of calling out your future is absolutely anti-biblical if we're talking about prophecy as we're looking at it now. I'm not saying that people don't have these gifts. I'm just saying that we need to not attribute everything that we have to God. Test the spirits. Okay? That means that not everything we speak is truth. And when someone gets, I have a prophetic word, test it. How do you test it? Does it come true? Is it something, well, I won't even get into that because that'll lead me down a bad path. So this is the voice of the prophet then. The voice of the prophet is against empire. And you see this no matter who is on the scene. They're up in front of the king. Okay, and these are the prophets that God has called. We'll talk about court prophets in just a second. They're up in front of the king. They're typically like Amos is a shepherd. He's not a prophet. He doesn't have a job giving prophecies. He doesn't have an email list where he sends you a personal prophecy for $25 a month. He's a herdsman. And God calls him. And what is the word that Amos must deliver to the nation? Justice. And justice that is not the opposite of mercy, but the fulfillment of it. The same for all justice. Do you think he wanted to deliver that word? A poor shepherd walks into the city where all the rich people are and says, this is what God wants. And they're like, yeah, right. No, but this is how it works. And so he's approaching the empire. Isaiah approaches the empire. Elijah approaches the empire. Elisha approaches the empire. They're all about making sure that the empire, who is doing what they do in the name of God, is not excluding those who are the lower ends of things. And it changes throughout their history. There's like a point in Israel's history where a shepherd is viewed as the lowest of the low, and yet that's what they came from. So this all changes, and it's like our morality now. So this is what we've got in the Old Testament. We've got a group of prophets who virtually don't give any futuristic words. They're not into that. We've got people who are condemned for seeing people who go into the futurism stuff. We've got other people who are condemned for going to see people who are into the generational curse, let's go into your past stuff. And then we've got the fact that witchcraft is almost inextricably linked with the word pharmakeia in the New Testament, which is where we get our word pharmacy. So all of this needs to be very much contextualized too. To understand that just because something is called witchcraft in the Bible doesn't necessarily mean that we'd address it the same way today. I mean, this is in Revelation, witchcraft that is cast into the lake of fire, that word is pharmakeia. I mean, how dare you work at powders and potions and try to cure people? You're a magician. So let's keep contextualizing things too as we go. Okay, so then in the Old Testament, we've also got these group of prophets who are kind of continually wrong. And those are the court prophets. And those are the ones who are always in front of people. And those are the ones who are voicing their God's approval of whoever happens to be in authority at the moment. And they are false prophets. Okay? So they're always called false prophets because none of their predictions ever come true. You're going to win this battle. Sorry, no, you didn't. We have to do this. No, you don't. And it just keeps getting contradicted by the prophet that God has called. Okay? And so when we see again today, when we stand up and we announce that God has elected so-and-so, you're a court prophet. And in the Bible, that's false prophecy. Okay? And I don't care. I'm not, whatever. I've gotten out of that. Let's go to one particular story that really tends to grate my thing. People think I'm a pacifist because I agree with it. And I'll go ahead and echo Stanley Hauerwas, who said, I don't preach pacifism because I'm a pacifist. I preach it because I'm a violent son of a bitch and I see the gospel as the cure. At least he's honest. Okay? And this isn't a quote that I like, but it's one that I believe. He says, Naaman is an officer of Israel's most dangerous enemy. This is Naaman the Syrian, and they're at war with Israel. Okay, this is not just like some people they've come upon. They're actually in active war. Okay? Naaman is an officer of Israel's most dangerous enemy, Syria. This did not prevent the prophet Elisha, who was zealous for Israel's God, from helping Naaman in his suffering without regard to the fact that the enemy's fighting strength would be increased if he were healed. Are we sure we want to be prophets? And then he finishes it with saying, we hear in the distance the words of the Savior. They don't know what they're doing. Okay, and this kind of pushes us forward a bit. And we arrive, after the so-called silent years when there were actually lots of books written. We just don't like them in our Protestant Bible. But we finally arrive at the time when, in these last days, God has spoken by a Son. And we begin to realize that the way that God speaks is not so much audibly, but incarnationally. Okay, and that, let's say this in a way that makes it really confusing so that you get it, is that, no, let's wait on it. We'll say it, but I'm going to wait. So in these last days, God's spoken by His Son, and no longer is He speaking by the prophets. This is the understood follow-up, okay? No longer is He speaking by the prophets because now He has spoken by a Son. Okay, and who is appointed the heir of all things? Don't worry about all that. Let's just stop with has spoken by His Son. And we can have fun with our eschatology and talk about in these last days and how that was written 2,000 years ago. But let's just focus on the Son. So that when God speaks, it's been revealed to be done in a way that isn't spoken. It's a non-vocal voice. And it's meant to be paradoxical. Okay, it's something that, let's describe it in a way that any parent will understand. When you have a sick child, I've actually prayed the prayer, but how many of us have prayed the prayer, give it to me instead? Okay, that's the voice of God, because it drives us to do something that we would not do normally, to take on the burden of another. That's something that only the incarnation can handle, is the willingness to absorb the burden of another. Okay? So only God can do that, in other words. So then what we get into then in the New Testament is the idea that, Jesus says, I only say what I hear my Father say, I only do what I hear my Father do. But I was just talking to Michael, and I actually think that's more of a confession, meaning like, I'm so mimetically attached to my Father, I can only do what I see Him do. It's not like Jesus isn't trying to bolster His activity. He kind of realizes that because His affections are set on Abba, that He's only going to be able to do what happens there. He's drawing His being from God instead of from those around Him. Okay? And again, you'll never see, Jesus doesn't like stand up and say things like, hey, Brother John in the back, I feel like you have this, that, or the other thing going on in your life. Or the generalistic, I feel like someone in here has back pain. Like, in a church this age, I could give a good prophetic word and like, I feel like someone in here has back pain, shoulder pain, wrist pain, knee pain, and we could even get real specific and still cover 8 or 10 people. But you never see Jesus do that. The only kind of thing that Jesus ever does remotely close to that is perceiving their thoughts, but I kind of tend to believe that's more the author than actually Jesus. How's the author know that Jesus perceived their thoughts? Because Jesus doesn't say, I perceived your thoughts. He perceived their thoughts and said. So maybe they recognized it after the fact. That, hey, Jesus must have perceived their thoughts. But notice Jesus, they don't call that prophecy. He just kind of says it. Jesus gave them a prophetic word. Brothers and sisters, I hear what you're thinking. You're thinking God can't be this good. Well, I'm here to tell you, no. And if Jesus really is prophetic, how many, in the sense that we think prophetic, how many of the people that he's with and ministering to, and would he just avoid if he's really that kind of prophet? There's no need to be taken out to the edge of a cliff and thrown over. He could have avoided that scenario altogether and just been like, hey, teaching, boom, see you guys later because I know what you're going to do. But he didn't. It caught him by surprise. Okay? So then this future-telling idea doesn't appear in Jesus either. Does Jesus make some statements about the coming destruction? Absolutely. But this is not prophecy. This is, I'm looking at what's going on around me politically, and we are not going to be able to sustain this. Okay, it's not prophetic in that sense. It's more socially aware. Rome is here, and we keep telling them they're illegitimate. Some stuff is about to go down, and it's going to be ugly because they're much bigger than we are. That's what Jesus' destruction prophecies really amount to. Okay? And then we keep moving forward, and we get into Acts, and some things happen that we're not going to talk about. But we get this guy, Paul, who hears God speak. And how does he hear God speak? In protection of those who Paul is casting out. He doesn't hear God speak, Paul, I have a plan for your life. I need you to do these 9 steps and then you'll be clean and I can convert you. It's, why are you persecuting me? That's it. It's a confrontation of his social justice. So the voice of the prophet has now become intimate, where it used to stand up in front of the empire and say, you have no idea what this is all about. It now stands in front of us and says, you have no idea what this is all about. Why are you persecuting me? And it makes things go internal, and it makes it become individual. Okay, and this is primary to Jesus' teaching. Deal with the plank in your own eye. Don't worry about them. I wrote something on Facebook a couple weeks ago about this plank eye situation being about perspective, not Jesus saying you have worse problems than everyone else. A speck in your eye looks like a plank from your point of view. It's still a speck. And in someone else's eye, what they think is a plank, you view as a speck. It's all perspective. Okay? So then, Paul hears God, and the way that Paul hears God causes him to, uncontrollably be moved in the direction of the other. Okay, it's no longer about the zeal with which he was spreading his particular brand of Judaism, or the zeal with which he was persecuting these other Jews who followed Jesus. It became about how this pans out if God really is that which holds all things together. This is Israel's belief. God's not unique to Israel. Israel is just one of God's chosen people. And so, and I've said this before, the fundamental presupposition that we got to approach everything with is God is. If we're going to read the Bible, we have to understand we're not approaching it trying to be proven of God's existence. If you don't believe that God is, that's fine, but don't use the Bible to prove to you that he is, because you won't get there. If you're going to read the Bible, you have to start with the presupposition that God is if you want to get kind of what's going on. At least from the author's point of view, that they believe God is. And so that with you and the author, you can't debate that. Within yourself, debate whatever you want. But so then we kind of come forward again, and it's just, there are no clear prophecies given in Scripture that either A, don't find their fulfillment in Jesus, or B, aren't entirely suspect. And I mean, some of them were just completely kicked out of the canon, like Enoch. You know, it was thought to be a prophetic book. Nope, gone, see you later. You know, and so some of what we read about Jesus then is what a scholar by the name of Dom Crossan has called prophecy historicized, which is just a nice way of saying, well, so for him it would be that Israel looked kind of wanted to put, whoever is writing, wanted to put Jesus into this mold, so they started creating little stories about him to make it fit the mold. For me, I would tend to think more they looked back and realized, hey, he fit that, and he fit that, and he fit that, and he fit that, and he fit that. You know, so it worked. So, but this is the point of it all, is that we don't get the luxury of standing in the moment and saying, I have a word from God. Unless that word from God kind of follows a specific pattern. And I'm not trying to say we have to box it in and get into rules and regulations. All I'm saying is there's a kind of a particular point where prophecy becomes prophecy instead of just words. And we don't get to declare that ourselves. So if I stand up here and I declare something, and I don't know what that would be, like, I don't know. You know, there's a Messiah coming. And nothing ever happens. Is that a prophetic word? No. If I stand up here and tell you, hey, the Broncos are going to win the Super Bowl this year, and they do, was that a prophetic word? No. At best, maybe you had a little bit of like a sixth sense about something, but that's not the way this works. And the reasoning for that is that we've gotten God so kind of pigeonholed into this little private, like me and my God together, and that's all I need is me and God. And the inescapable fact is that no matter where you go, that's all you have. And Jesus has told us and actually commanded us, and we hate that word, but commanded us to love one another, and love requires communion. And I know there's two requires in one sentence. We got to check it. It's okay to be required to do something when the motive is love. Love requires us to include. You know, it's just what it's requiring that we got to be careful with how we say it. Okay? So then God's going to speak in such a way that is going to, let's take it Old Testament and say it's going to confront the empire. But if we take it in the full scope of the Bible, what we're going to say is that a prophetic word will confront the empire within. Okay? And it will not be delivered by someone else to you. I want you to hear that as clearly as you can. Nobody will call out your sin and be right about it. God doesn't give them that kind of knowledge. Yeah, let's let it settle for a moment. Because that needs to feel good. And you need to, like, I used to be scared when I was a drug addict to go to prophecy conferences. Because I was just sure they were going to be like, there's a guy here who has done some pretty heinous things. And you know what? They never did. Because that's not God. God's not in the least bit interested in calling out some individual's problem as though you have the worst problem ever known to man. You're not the worst, you're not the best, you're nowhere close to either one. And that's freeing for us. So how do we hear God's voice? Let's get out all that discussion and get into actually hearing God's voice. And I'll say it now. I want to say that I believe that when we hear God's voice, we hear nothing at all but are uncontrollably driven toward the other. And we have this really lame word now that we use for that, and it's called empathy. And empathy in no way describes what is actually taking place, but it is the word we have. And again, this goes back to like parents of young children. Empathy is what pushes you to say, give it to me instead. Even though that's not going to happen, you still say it. I'll take it. Can I have the fever? I don't want my kid to suffer anymore. Empathy is what drove me into the mountains to tell God, look, you're either going to make me feel my wife's pain or you're going to fix it for her. And I felt it. Empathy drives us to do things that we would otherwise have no desire to do. It's not like, well, I kind of want to do this anyways, and so I feel led. When you're feeling led to do something that you've always loved to do, it's probably not God. That's not mean it's bad, okay? It's probably just you because you like to do it. I'm feeling led to go home and work in my garden today because I want to be out in the sun. But that's not God. Paul addresses something, the writer of Ephesians addresses something in Ephesians where he says, sons of disobedience. And this little word disobedience in the Greek is apatheia. And it sounds a lot like the word that it means, and that's apathy. And so then, at least from that perspective of that particular verse, disobedience is equal to apathy. Which means that when we're not moved in the direction of the other, we haven't heard God. Because empathy is the opposite of apathy. Okay, I only do what I see my Father do. I only say what I hear my Father say. And then what does Jesus do? He is continually driven in the direction of those who are cast out. Prostitutes, thieves, liars, backstabbers. Philip was from Greece, and they're really open sexually. And Jesus never confronts him about his society's sexuality. Thomas doesn't believe him. Peter denies him. Judas betrays him, and he's at the table with them. And you think you got to get your stuff together before God will speak to you. In the flesh and blood, God spoke to people who our society would not allow at the table, much less to open their mouths. Can you imagine bringing a prostitute to church who everybody knew was going to go back to her vocation after church and not having her feel condemned? Woman washes Jesus' feet, and she's a prostitute, and nowhere does he ever condemn their job. I mean, come on. We've let our morals go so far that we are deaf to God because our morals have completely trumped any way that we could ever be moved in empathy towards those who are cast out. We are only ever moved in empathy towards those who are cast out within our circle. You know, still within the circle. It's just a few people don't like them, so we're going to go be friends with them again. But what I'm talking about when I say cast out is I'm talking about like transgenders in our day. People who are not accepted and who are told, well, you know, there's some things that are going to have to change if you're going to be a Christian. Because that's what Jesus said. And so I think it's this idea of we can say, I heard God, but only 5 to 10 years later. Maybe not that time frame, but what I'm saying is we've got to get to the point where we stop being so arrogant as to think God is giving me personal directions for my life right now while ignoring 99% of the population. But we also need to understand that the Spirit will continually do her job of renewing our minds. And so both are going on. We have this internal paradox of God's not going to do something for me that is going to require He take from someone else. Let's just level that one out for a second. Oh, God sees you being a billionaire. Wealth is a limited commodity. There's only so much. So for you to become a billionaire means that someone or several other someones must now be taken down a level. Test the spirits. Does that sound like something that would approach us and say, why are you persecuting me? Or does that sound like something that would approach us and say, hey, I have a promise of something if you'll just fall down and worship me? This is what, you know, the writer of Hebrews means later on when they talk about the Word of God being active and able to divide. Okay, the spoken Word of God is able to divide internally within you between your internal empire and your internal, being. Because those two are constantly at war with each other. This is the war that Paul talks about. And by empire, I don't mean like our nationality. I just mean our propensity towards treating everything as though it's our personal world, that we're in control of. And that personal empire is what we tend to get most offended by when people cross our borders. Or within. We get offended within it. Well, my empire is that I'm a theologian and I do this and I do that and I do this. And so, in other words, that means I can't let in those who are not. Or my personal empire is that I'm a Baptist. And so that means I cannot let in charismatics because I'm also a cessationist. Not all Baptists are cessationists, but that's a really rude way to make the point. But this is what we do. Our personal empire becomes more important. And because we kind of have the propensity to be court prophets and kings in our own imaginations. Oh, I'm a king of my empire, so I need a court prophet to affirm everything that I've already set up in the empire that I built. And so the court prophet comes in and begins to confirm things for us. Oh, brother, I already had that going. Oh, God says you're stepping in the right direction. You know what? I had a guy prophesy over me one time. God says he sees you teaching all around the world. Go, go, go. He's for you. And then that same person took to discounting everything I taught. And it's like, I get it. Sometimes the dissonance in our brains can't handle what's just played out in front of us. So either God says go, 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 or he doesn't, and you've just become an unfortunate false prophet. And I'm not saying let's be Old Testament and stone them. But just understand that at that point it's no longer prophecy. And it's okay. So what do? We've got to look back. We are constantly looking back. We are walking backward, forward. Dylan and Liam, I don't know where they learned it, because we have not taught them, but when they don't want something that we're offering, they both go. And we've got to learn to do that too. To understand that just because a voice of affirmation comes into our life that affirms a lot of the things we've already been doing to bolster our personal empire, that does not mean that it is God. In fact, it means it probably isn't. Because when it bolsters a personal empire, there's a big problem. That's not even a national empire. And personal empires are where we create denominations and civil wars within Christianity. And so the voice of God will always come in opposition to our empires. It will always bring to us something that is immensely uncomfortable, like, why do you condemn me? Why do you persecute me? Let justice roll like a river, things like that. It will always deal with things that have happened in our lives and say, this is where God has proven himself faithful. And it will upset some things that we think. And I like to use Ezekiel with Sodom and Gomorrah here. It's my favorite verse to quote just because of where we are in America right now. What was the sin of your sister Sodom? She rejected the poor and the outcast among her and grew fat. Had nothing to do with anything sexual. And so it also readjusts our history when we hear a word from God. Are you seeing how this is really opposite to how we viewed prophecy today? Instead of it adjusting our future, do you really want to know your future? Do you think that God really wants us knowing every intimate detail about our lives? How boring. Well, it's next Tuesday, 4:30, I get in a car wreck, so I'm not going to go anywhere. And you wouldn't live your life if you knew everything about it. You don't want that kind of word. What we want is we want to be confronted, to say, okay, yes, I've erected a personal empire. I've built this thing on the sand. And just the very fact that I've erected it means it's a problem. And it looks different for all of us. Some of us it's our education, some of us it's our jobs, some of us it's our ability to parent, some of us it's whatever. But that little empire is what the Spirit of God is interested in disrupting and in speaking to us and saying. So how do we hear God's voice then? You don't. You only recognize it later. When you are, it's hard to do when you start thinking this way too, because you feel yourself being driven and you're like, well, I wonder if this is the voice of God, because we always need to have that. But the primary point of all of it is, no, as we go through life, we do things, like as Jeff said, to bring love into the situation. and whatever we've done to try and bring love into the situation, then later on we look back and we see what God did with that. And then that internal, like, man, how do I bring love into a situation where me and a friend are at an impasse over politics? You know, I mean, it's going to be different for everybody. I'm not giving you an answer here. But that moment where I bring love into that impasse is the voice of God. And it's not comfortable for us who want to hear like English language come into our heads. And conversely, it's very much an affirmation of humanity that we think the thoughts that we do. So I'm not saying that the thoughts that you have are not good thoughts. I think it's a testament to how much God loves every human, that we have the ability to think the kind of thoughts that we do. But if we want to call something prophecy, if we want to be faithful to what the Bible calls prophecy, we can only do so after the fact. We can't do so in the moment. God, are you speaking to me, is never going to be answered by yes or no with any clarity, because you're always going to doubt it. But I believe I heard something or felt something or thought I should go this way, bearing fruit of people being included and feeling justified and feeling like they're just as good as the preacher down the street. I would say that you've heard the voice of God in your movement. I know it's going to be uncomfortable for a lot. It was really uncomfortable for me to just learn that the nothing that we're afraid of is exactly what we're supposed to be pursuing. Because God is nothing. He is no thing. And only when we kind of like lock into that and sit back and settle into the nothing that is God will we begin to kind of see, oh wow, man, God proved himself faithful here. Because we're not trying to dress it up anymore. Well, I know that can't be God because I was sick. Well, God didn't make you sick, but what did God do in this situation? Did you see something happen? You know, like me and my dad were talking on the way here today. If you go out to the car and pray for that little girl, I'll heal her, is only a prophetic word because my dad did it. If he had never prayed for my sister, that's not a prophetic word. It's just a thought in his head. Okay, so there's a prophetic word that enacted change, but guess what else it did? It forever changed his past and his future because it changes the hermeneutic of how we view healing. Oh, if you'll go out and pray for that little girl, I'll heal her. In my dad's mind, might have been she'll be cured for the moment and might need medical care later. Might have been she'll get better. Might have been she'll be healed and whole. But that's all moot now because the proof is that it was a permanent healing. Okay, so this is kind of how we approach hearing God. And this is how we hear God in the world today, is when we are being moved uncontrollably in the direction of those who are otherwise cast out. I don't care about how right you can get all of my social security number and birth date from the stage. I will not call you a prophet until you've confronted the empire within. Because that's the voice of God. That's the voice of the prophet. This is what the Hebrew prophet was. This is what the New Testament prophet is. I mean, Paul's statement, Jesus is Lord, is not a divinity statement. Caesar was Lord at the time. Lord is a title. Duke is a title. Caesar is Lord. So every time Paul says Jesus is Lord, Caesar is not, is carried out afterwards. This is prophetic. Paul is standing up to the empire. Jesus stands up to the empire. How? Now, you think you're doing my Father's will. Flipping tables in the temple. Those are prophetic acts. Okay? All right, I think that's it. You're dismissed, or do you want to say anything? No, you're dismissed. Oh, do you want to do communion? Dad? Yeah. So you're not dismissed.